Welcome to this final video walkthrough of Underlayered Suspicion, a review of CRA audits of Muslim-led charities. The previous walkthroughs have taken you through the whole of government policies on anti-terrorism financing and counter-radicalization. And those walkthroughs showed how those two policies can create the conditions for systemic bias, racism, and bigotry as it relates to the charities under audit in this report. The anti-terrorism financing regime in particular has an overt bias against Muslims given the way it maps the threat of terrorist financing onto Muslim communities here in Canada. To recall, according to the Government of Canada, 100% of terrorist financing risk comes from racialized and religious minorities. One of the groups it identifies of the 10 is Tamil, one is Sikh, the other 8 are Muslim or Arab specified, which means that 80% of terrorist financing risk, according to the Government of Canada, maps directly onto Muslim and Arab communities. This creates an overt bias. Now, we may find that perhaps these organizations are worthy of such concern, but so too should we be equally concerned about the civil liberties of our citizens who may be unduly captured by this large, overbearing net. So the issue isn't whether it's this, we're not suggesting a zero-sum game, you have to pick one or the other, but rather, even if one were to signal that these organizations pose the greatest threat, and if that were factually true, that doesn't preclude checks and balances against government reach, against the liberties and the civil liberties of groups like those charities addressed herein. And so we want to suggest a both and approach. You can protect the civil liberties of individuals, you can protect the country from external and internal threat, but you simply have to do it with better scholarship, better analysis, better evidence. So our conclusions to the report raise some concerns around whether or not the Government of Canada can do this or is doing this. We know that September 11th, 2001 was a signal moment for many in the national security industry in Europe, North America, Canada in particular, for instance here. We know that Muslims, Sharia, Islam, headscarves, veils, burqas, these are all symbols of otherness, of foreignness, of threat that are deemed to be counter to core values of the nation. But we also see how that bias culturally plays into government policy, and alternatively, how government policy perpetuates those sorts of cultural biases. And we show that throughout this particular analysis in the way in which foreign events are interpreted domestically, debated in question period in Parliament, and ultimately affect outcomes at the most mundane bureaucratic level. Now, the virtue of this study, we feel, is that it provides a very close analysis of how audits proceed, of the kinds of rationalizing analyses at play in the sifting of different kinds of evidence. That kind of close analysis is meant to suggest this is not just simply a top-down analysis of government's legislative frameworks. That's an important mechanism and that's an important piece of this story. And thankfully, groups like the International Civil Liberties Monitoring Group have done work on that. What this does is it takes some top-down policies and coordinates it with some bottom-up analysis and showcases how the two sandwich groups in the middle, specifically Muslim-led charities. And the concern is that those groups ought not to be so sandwiched. So the recommendations that come out of this report are fairly straightforward. They're directed, 1, to the Canada Revenue Agency, 2, to Finance Canada, and 3, to the Ministry of Public Safety. The Canada Revenue Agency receives the most attention among our recommendations. The first and foremost is to suspend RAD, the Research and Analysis Division. This was, as indicated in an earlier walkthrough, RAD was a development out of 9/11, out of the national security legislation that was passed, to be within the CRA, an intelligence surveillance and analysis group. This is the group that works in somewhat mysterious ways, non-transparent ways, unaccountable ways, certainly to any oversight body, to integrate Canada's whole of government national security strategy with the CRA and its audits practices. RAD needs to be suspended until Canada has reassessed its risk-based analysis model, its national security, as national strategy to combat extremism and radicalization, and ultimately really thought long and hard about possibly creating a number of oversights, civilian oversights, that ensure RAD also has a check and balance on its activities in the interests of civil liberties. We also think that for as long as anti-terrorism financing policies or counter-radicalization policies continue to inform these audits, particularly under the current circumstances, then given that Muslim charities are uniquely vulnerable to the intersection of these policies, we recommend that the CRA suspend the discretionary use of revocation power in these audits. The CRA has a number of tools at hand to discipline charities, revocation being only one and the most extreme. But when these organizations are subject to audit, possibly for reasons unknown to them, using standards unknown to them, evidence unknown to them, evidence analyzed in ways that perhaps may very well be result-oriented, there are serious concerns about transparency, accountability, and just good governance at play here, not to mention the liberties of these organizations to begin with. By suspending the revocation power in these limited cases, in these very specific instances, we offer a balance, a check and a balance against the CRA's over-aggressive use of its coercive authority. And lastly, we believe that the CRA really needs to think more robustly about transparency. We show in the report that in testimony before the Senate, the Charities Directorate and the RAD Director said that organizations who are suspect because of anti-terrorism financing concerns are not always told that that is why they're being audited. Rather, there's a deference to simple techniques of audit practices. But in this case, then, the audit practices become a cover and a pretext for what is for a much more deeply concerning set of deeply troubling set of concerns held by the government. But those concerns play out in the nature of the audit, in the execution of the audit, raising questions among audited organizations as to why the audit is taking the shape it has. Ultimately, at the end of the day, it raises fundamental questions of notice, where notice is a simple issue of rule of law. Parties need to know what the law is. Parties need to know what exactly they're being accused of and why they're being subject to this kind of process. It's simple, basic rule of law, and the failure of the government to recognize this is alarming. So we suggest the CRA adopt enhanced transparency as a mode of ensuring accountability to the parties that are most vulnerable to these kinds of audits. Our recommendation to Finance Canada is to quickly undertake a revision and reassessment of its risk-based assessment formula, both in light of evolving standards at the FATF, but also in light of considerations around civil liberties here in Canada. We believe the Finance Canada ought to convene a robust review comprised of a diverse array of stakeholders to review and revise its RBA to better control against possible disproportionate effects on a subset of Canadian citizens and charitable organizations. And we do hope that as they do so, they'll keep in mind current efforts underway at the FATF to examine the unintended consequences of the RBA as it applies to charities across the board. And lastly, to public safety. Public safety ought to provide better guidance to the various agencies of the government that take a cue from its national strategy to combat radicalization. Simply articulating radicalization is located in this early stage of extreme ideas is somewhat dangerous when left in the hands of a bureaucrat looking to perform an audit. In these cases, notions of radicalization, notions of extreme ideas become ultimately get compressed and confused and compiled with other biases around what extremism looks like, what extremism sounds like, and ultimately in that context can lead to a biased application of standards around radicalization applied specifically in this case to Muslim organizations and not others. So we think public safety needs to better understand that its policies do have an effect across the government and to be cognizant of how it should advise its own people across the different levels of government on how to apply this policy. Until then, we hope the CRA will take cognizance that this policy raises concerns of systemic bias across the board. So I want to thank you on behalf of my co-author Nadia Hassan of NCCM and myself. I want to thank you for taking the time to view these video walkthroughs. We hope you've had a chance to read the report, and if you haven't, hopefully the walkthroughs will help you find your way through. It is a long report, it's detailed, but it's designed exactly in that way to ensure depth and clarity and precision. The report was very much taken and designed in the spirit of academic excellence with an eye towards public advocacy, and we hope that it achieves that purpose with you. Thank you very much.